Today, we're going to talk about what are the advantages and disadvantages of a corporation. And we're going to get started right now. Hi, my name is Taylor Darcy with Darcy Law. I work with startups, entrepreneurs, and small businesses to help them with their legal needs. Okay, so one of the things that people always want to know is why should I form a corporation? And what are the advantages and disadvantages? Now, there are typically more advantages than disadvantages, but there are some advantages. So we're going to go through those here. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments, but I'd be more than happy to talk to you more about these. So, one of the advantages of a corporation is that you can build a business that is incorporated and then sell the stock in the corporation, and all of the assets that are owned by the corporation are then transferred via the stock sale. Now, the reason why that's important is in a sole proprietorship, if you if you're trying to sell a sole proprietorship, all of those assets, the benefits, all of those things are typically owned in that person's name, which means it has limited use on how you can then divest yourself or sell your interest in those things. It's a lot more complicated as opposed to selling shares. Now, that's a pretty big advantage. Another advantage of the corporation is the liability shield. We've talked about that a little bit before, but the short version of it is that the assets that you invest in the corporation are what is limited. What does that mean? So if you invest $1,000 or $10,000 or $100,000 in a company, the most that you can lose is $100,000. They typically cannot come after your personal assets. Now, I say typically because it is possible that they need that if you were to there are certain instances in which they can pierce the corporate veil, and I've talked about this extensively, but this is important disadvantage or advantage and kind of a double-edged sword. So we'll talk about it in both contexts. As an advantage, you have very limited amount of risk. In other words, if you have $100,000 invested and the company tanks, assuming that they can't pierce the corporate veil, that's how much you're limited to. If they can't come after your house, they can't come after your other assets, other things that you have. So it's really good as an advantage. The disadvantage is that if you don't keep up with the corporate formalities and you are sued or you are bankrupt, they can come after your personal assets. And what does that mean? In other words, they could attach a lien on your property. They could levy other things. Now, is it likely to happen? No, but it is possible. And so it's the level of risk. Corporate formalities is one component of what you have to keep up with. What does that mean? You have to maintain your bylaws. You have to have annual meetings. You have to have minutes done. You have to keep up with those decisions that I listed in how to form a corporation's video. You have to keep up with those things on a regular basis. You can't just put it on the shelf and then never do anything, never touch it, and just, oh, okay, we'll get to it someday. No. A corporation requires maintenance. And that's a pretty big disadvantage, right? Because especially when it's a small corporation, people think that they don't need to keep up with these things. They don't make the time to keep up with them because they're too busy with the business. And then a couple of years go by and they're super duper successful. And then all of a sudden they get hit with a lawsuit. And now they're having to deal with that. And now, are they going to pierce the corporate veil? No, not necessarily, but they can, or they can try to. And that adds to the time and the expense of dealing with the lawsuit. So it's not a perfect system, right? But it does encourage people to invest. I've talked about in why to form a corporation. What are those types of things? So the advantages are limited liability, also a business structure. You're also looking at being able to divest yourself from the business. those are very important because it means it's worth more, right? You yourself can only be worth so much, but someone else can then come along and buy shares in a corporation, and now they're the owner of the corporation. The other thing is that you can sell portions of interest for investment purposes. So in other words, someone comes along and they're like, "Hey, I think you've got a great idea here. Rather than give you a loan, I'd rather be an equity and a holder." And so they can then become an investor in your company, subject to securities laws, that can give you money, and they can then enjoy the profits and losses of the business along with you. They can be an active partner, they can be a silent partner, and there's all sorts of different scenarios that they can do. And so you're opening your world up, right? A lot of these sole proprietors that get started, their world's fairly narrow. They do their job and they're self-employed. They're not really looking to grow. They're just looking to have an income and be able to provide for themselves and their families. That's great, and you can absolutely do that. And as a sole proprietor, but as with the corporation, it opens up the world. It opens up a lot of flexibility to how you can manage your business, but the disadvantage of that you have to keep up with those formalities. And that's one factor that they look at. Another factor is whether you've used, and this is all in regards to piercing the corporate veil, if you've used essentially your corporation or your bank account to fund your personal things, they look at that and say, well, if you've kept it one and the same, then why are we going to give you liability protection? The next part of the equation is whether you are undercapitalized. What does it mean to be undercapitalized? If your debts drastically exceed your revenue, your assets. Okay. The next part of it is if you started a corporation with the intent to defraud someone. So the idea is you start a corporation and then your goal was to actually take people's money without providing the service or good that you're promising to provide. So those are the instances in which you can do a corporate veil, or that they can pierce the corporate veil. Another disadvantage, not disadvantage, but another factor that goes into this is a corporation doesn't cover everything, right? And what I mean by that is that, I've had people question, forming a corporation, and they say, oh, you should just get liability insurance. Well, why not do both? There's no reason why a corporation can't do both. So I always recommend to my client, you form a corporation, you get your liability insurance, so that if something goes wrong, and it inevitably does, if you've been in business long enough, it's likely that you're going to get sued or need to sue somebody. But so I always talk about having layers, like Shrek, onions, ogres have layers. Having layers of protection, and part of that is you want to have a good contract. You want to have good contracts with your clients, and or with your vendors, so both ways. And then the other part of it is that you want to have good liability insurance, umbrella, general liability, that type of thing. And then obviously having a corporation. Now, will that protect you in every instance? No, but it will give you enough things to protect you that it'll make it very hard that it will ruin that bad things will happen and it will ruin your life or your job or whatnot. Another disadvantage to a corporation is that unless you form an S corp, actually that's a tax designation. It's called small business corporation. Unless you have that as your specific tax designation, you are what's considered double taxed. What does that mean? Double tax simply is a corporation is the stockholder is taxed on its earnings of the shares, and then the corporation is taxed on the its earnings as well. So if unless you form an S corp, which we're not going to talk about the specifics on an S corp today, we will talk about that at a future video. And just keep that in mind, is that I am getting it to it, but I only have so much time. But I digress. So if a disadvantage to a corporation is that if at the smaller level you're looking at being taxed twice. Okay. And so the issue becomes, is it worth it to do a bigger corporation, or doing a corporation at this level without the S corp status? Now, There's some reasons why that might be true and some reasons why it not be true. And again, we're not going to talk about that. But in this instance, keep in mind that those are that's a major disadvantage to forming a corporation that you want to consider, right? Because no one wants to pay any more taxes than they absolutely have to. And at a small, corporation, and as long as you qualify, you can designate with the S corp, and you get the same pass-through taxation that a LLC gets. And so that's important to know, is that there are ways around it a little bit, but once you fall outside that S corp designation possibility, then there's not. But hopefully by the time you're that big, then it won't be a factor anymore, and you're okay with the fact that you're paying different taxes at that point. So so those are just some of the advantages and disadvantages. I'd love to hear if you have any comments. Feel free to leave them. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, everywhere. So look forward to hearing from you. Hope you have a great day. Bye.